Hey, you in the costume, hold it right there.
Officer, are you addressing me?
Yeah, you. Where'd you get the outfit? Show me ID, now.
I am Lieutenant General Marcus Stone. My CAC is in my jacket. I'm reaching for it.
Hands, don't move.
You asked for my identification.
Don't get smart. You're shaking. You're high, aren't you?
I have a prosthetic leg.
I don't care. Turn around. Hands behind your head.
Officer Bradley Thorne, a 45-year-old veteran of the Washington, D.C. Transit Police, stood near the East Hall entrance of Union Station at exactly 8:15 a.m. Among the rank and file of his precinct, Thorne was known as Old School. In the sterile, clinical language of internal affairs, however, this was code for an officer with a short fuse, a heavy hand, and a personnel file containing 12 buried complaints regarding racial profiling. On this particular Tuesday morning, Thorne was bored. He was looking for a reason to assert authority, and he found it in the form of a black man walking through the terminal wearing the full dress blues of a United States Army Lieutenant General. In that split second, Officer Thorne made a judgment call that would cost him his pension, his freedom, and his name. He decided the uniform was a costume. He decided the medals were purchased online. And, noticing the man's slight rhythmic limp, he decided the suspect was intoxicated. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to hit the like button for more stories you don't want to miss. What Officer Thorne did not know was that Lieutenant General Marcus Stone had just left a classified briefing at the White House and was en route to the Pentagon. Thorne did not know that the general's limp was not caused by alcohol or narcotics, but by phantom pains flaring up in a stump where his left leg used to be, a leg lost while pulling 3 men from a burning vehicle in Syria. And most critically, the officer did not know that the general's prosthetic was not a standard medical device. It was a classified experimental symbionic prototype worth $112,000, equipped with biometric sensors that were currently transmitting real-time data to a server at the National Military Command Center. But Thorne saw none of this. He saw only a target. He nudged his partner, Officer Ryan Miller. Miller was a rookie, only 4 months out of the academy, and he had already learned that the safest way to survive a shift with Thorne was to keep his mouth shut. Thorne gestured with his chin toward the general. He pointed out the target, calling him a peacock, walking around without a security detail. He called it a classic case of stolen valor. He told Miller that the man had likely pinned on some badges to get a free coffee or a discount on a train ticket. He pointed to the walk, the lean, the sway, and bet $100 that the suspect was high. Officer Miller squinted at the approaching figure. The uniform was impeccable. The creases on the trousers were razor sharp. The ribbon rack on the chest was perfectly aligned. Miller hesitated, suggesting that the uniform looked regulation and that they should perhaps let him pass. Thorne hissed at him to shut up. He adjusted his duty belt, instructing the rookie to stop looking at the clothes and start looking at the behavior. He claimed the suspect was nervous, looking around, and clearly didn't belong there. Thorne announced that they were going to take him down. In reality, General Stone was not nervous. He was in pain. The carbon fiber socket of his prosthetic was chafing against his residual limb due to the humidity in the station. He was scanning the room not for police, but for the nearest place to sit down and relieve the pressure on his severed nerve endings. He was thinking about the intelligence report in his briefcase and the coffee he hadn't had time to drink. Thorne stepped away from the wall, moving with the predatory confidence of a man who believes he is untouchable. He positioned himself directly in the general's path, blocking the route to the platforms. His voice cut through the morning crowd as he called out to the man in the costume to hold it right there. General Stone stopped. He did not flinch. He did not run. He simply turned his head slowly, his face carved from granite. He looked at Thorne's badge, then directly into his eyes. He asked, with the low, quiet authority of a man who had commanded thousands of troops in combat, if the officer was addressing him. Thorne smirked. This quiet confidence annoyed him. To a man like Thorne, calmness in the face of police authority was not a sign of innocence. It was a sign of arrogance. And arrogance needed to be punished. He stepped into the general's personal space, violating the tactical distance taught in the academy. He asked where the outfit came from, suggesting a costume shop, and demanded to see identification for that rank immediately. General Stone sighed internally. He had dealt with enemies of the state, with insurgents, and with politicians. He recognized the look in Thorne's eyes. It was the look of a small man with a little bit of power, desperate to feel big. Speaking loud enough for the passing commuters to hear, Stone identified himself as Lieutenant General Marcus Stone on official travel. He stated he did not have time for games and that his common access card was in his inside jacket pocket. He announced he was going to reach for it. This was the moment. The trap was set. Thorne barked at him to watch his hands, dropping his own hand to his holster and unsnapping the retention strap. He ordered Stone to keep his hands where he could see them and not to move. Stone replied steadily, though his pulse began to register a spike on the biometric monitors in his leg that the officer had just asked for identification. He explained he could not produce it if he could not move his hands. Thorne yelled, escalating the volume to attract attention, trying to build a theater of compliance for the onlookers. He accused Stone of twitching and shaking. Stone explained patiently that he was shifting his weight because he had a prosthetic leg and standing still was painful. Thorne cut him off, shouting that he didn't care what he had. He had committed now. The crowd was watching. If he backed down, he would look weak. If he let the man go, he would lose face. There was only one way forward for Officer Thorne: total domination. He signaled to Miller to cover the suspect, declaring him non-compliant. Thorne unholstered his telescopic baton. With a flick of his wrist, the steel shaft extended. He was 16 minutes away from a federal prison cell. He was 10 seconds away from destroying his life, and he still thought he was the one in control. He commanded Stone to turn around, interlace his fingers, and get on his knees. Stone braced himself and refused to kneel, warning the officer to think very carefully about his next move. Thorne didn't think. He swung. The baton struck the back of General Stone's thigh. In police academy training, this is known as a compliance strike, a calculated blow designed to target the common perineal nerve. The intended result is a temporary motor dysfunction that causes the leg to buckle, forcing a suspect to the ground without causing permanent injury. Officer Thorne expected a specific reaction: a sharp intake of breath, a collapse of the knee, and immediate submission. But General Stone did not collapse. The baton bounced off the rigid carbon fiber shell beneath the dress trousers with a dull, hollow thud. To Officer Thorne, in his adrenaline-fueled tunnel vision, this lack of reaction was not evidence of a prosthetic. It was evidence of something else entirely. In his mind, the man's refusal to fall was proof of a drug-induced immunity to pain. He roared for his partner to grab the suspect, holstering the baton and lunging forward to grapple the general's upper body. What followed was a textbook example of what use of force experts call a conflicting command loop. It is a psychological and physical trap where an officer issues orders that are impossible to obey simultaneously, creating a pretext for escalated violence. Thorne grabbed Stone's left wrist, twisting it high up his back in a joint lock, screaming for him to give up his other hand. In the same breath, he pulled up on the general's collar, keeping him upright, while shouting for him to get on the ground. General Stone, a man who had maintained his composure during mortar attacks in the Middle East, realized he was in a dangerous situation. He knew that any sudden movement would be interpreted as an attack. He tried to speak through the pain of the shoulder lock, explaining that his left leg did not bend that way and that he was wearing a prosthetic. But Thorne was no longer listening. He was performing for the audience. He needed the crowd to see a struggle so they would justify the violence he was about to inflict. Officer Ryan Miller, the rookie, stood frozen 3 feet away. He saw the confusion in the general's eyes. He saw that the man wasn't fighting back. He was struggling to keep his balance against the contradictory forces being applied to his body. Miller opened his mouth to speak, to tell his partner to wait, but the fear of defying his senior officer choked the words in his throat. Miller stepped back, becoming a silent accomplice to the disaster. Thorne, frustrated by Stone's refusal to crumple, decided to end the engagement. He used his bulk to pin the general against a marble pillar. He leaned in close, his face inches from Stone's ear. He lowered his voice to a whisper, believing the noise of the terminal and the lack of witnesses in his immediate radius would protect him. He told the general that he knew his type. He called him a boy. He hissed that the uniform didn't make him one of them, and that he owned him right now. The slur hung in the air, captured in high-definition audio by the body camera Thorne had forgotten was recording. Stone stiffened. The insult was not just unprofessional, it was a clear violation of civil rights statutes. He warned the officer that he was making a grave mistake. But Thorne had reached the point of no return. He yelled for a takedown. He executed a leg sweep, hooking his heavy tactical boot behind the general's left knee, the knee he believed was locking up due to defiance, and threw his entire 200-pound body weight forward to drive the suspect into the floor. The physics of the moment were unforgiving. A human knee is a complex hinge of cartilage and ligament. When forced backward, it tears. But the knee of a symbiotic leg 3 is a masterpiece of aerospace engineering. Titanium servos, hydraulic pistons, and a high-tension polymer frame. It does not tear, it shears. As Thorne drove them both toward the ground, the torque on the prosthetic exceeded its structural rating. The sound that echoed through Union Station was not human. It was a violent mechanical screech, like a car wreck compressed into a single, terrifying millisecond. It was the sound of $12,000 worth of titanium shearing in half. General Stone gasped as his center of gravity vanished. The lower half of his leg, now severed from the hydraulic joint, swung uselessly inside his trouser leg. He crashed face first onto the polished granite floor. His briefcase slid across the tiles, stopping at the feet of a horrified tourist. Thorne landed on top of him, driving his knee between the general's shoulder blades. He grabbed Stone's wrists and ratcheted the handcuffs tight, the metal biting into the skin. Thorne yelled at the crowd to stop moving, but beneath him, General Stone lay still. He was not unconscious. He was running a system check on his body, a habit from his days in special operations. Ribs bruised, shoulder dislocated, prosthetic, catastrophic failure. He wheezed, his face pressed against the cold floor, telling the officer he had just broken the hydraulic seal. Thorne looked down. He expected to see a twisted ankle or perhaps a broken shin. Instead, he saw the general's left pant leg. It was torn open. There was no blood. There was no white bone. Sticking out of the fabric was a jagged shard of matte black metal. A severed wire whipped back and forth, sparking blue electricity against the marble floor. A dark, oily hydraulic fluid began to pool rapidly around the general's boot. Thorne blinked. His brain struggled to process the image. A robot leg, sparks, oil, fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his anger. He had made a massive mistake, but Officer Thorne did not apologize. He did not call for a medic. His instinct for self-preservation kicked in, and he chose the most dangerous path possible. He decided to lie. Thorne scrambled backward, unholstering his service weapon and pointing it at the prone general. He screamed into his radio that the suspect had a device. He claimed the suspect was rigged. He yelled that it was a possible suicide bomber and ordered the terminal cleared. The crowd, which had been watching in confused silence, erupted into chaos. People dropped their bags and ran. But amidst the stampede, the general lifted his head. He looked at Thorne with eyes that were cold as absolute zero. He told the officer that it was not a bomb. He called him an imbecile. He stated it was a combat prosthetic, and that the officer was about to wish it was a bomb. For 90 seconds, Union Station existed in a state of suspended animation. Officer Thorne stood over the prone general, his service weapon leveled at the man's head, his chest heaving as he screamed at the crowd to get back. He was shouting that he had neutralized a terrorist threat, claiming the sparking wires were evidence of an explosive device. But the crowd was not running. In the age of digital surveillance, the public has learned to recognize the difference between a bomb and a botch. The sparking device was clearly a shattered mechanical limb. The terrorist was clearly a decorated officer lying face down in a pool of hydraulic fluid. Instead of fleeing, 30 or 40 commuters raised their smartphones. They formed a silent recording ring around the scene, capturing the high-definition evidence that would later make jury selection nearly impossible. Thorne yelled for his partner to call the bomb squad, sweat stinging his eyes. But the command that followed did not come from the rookie. It came from Sergeant Angela Hayes, the shift supervisor. She had been monitoring the radio traffic and had sprinted from the West Hall the moment she heard the phrase, "suicide bomber." She burst through the circle of onlookers and skidded to a halt, her eyes taking in the scene in a single, practiced sweep. She saw the shattered titanium on the floor. She saw the sparking wires. She saw the 3 silver stars on the suspect's shoulder boards. And, most terrifying of all, she saw her subordinate pointing a loaded Glock 17 at a lieutenant general of the United States Army. She screamed for Thorne to holster his weapon, threatening to drop him herself if he did not comply. Thorne blinked, breaking his tunnel vision, and tried to argue that the suspect was rigged. Hayes shoved him back physically, forcing him to lower his gun. She dropped to her knees beside Stone, ignoring the dark oil ruining her uniform pants. She saw the damage immediately. Sergeant Hayes was a veteran. She knew what a symbionic unit looked like. She knew it cost more than her house. And she knew that breaking one required a level of negligence that bordered on criminal. She addressed the general, her voice trembling slightly, identifying herself and securing the scene. She asked if he was injured. General Stone turned his head, his cheek bruised from the impact. He stated calmly that his mobility unit was destroyed. He had secondary trauma to the residual limb, and he was currently being held at gunpoint by a civil servant. Hayes apologized profusely, reaching for her handcuff key. She told him they were going to get him up and that she was taking the cuffs off right now. But Stone stopped her with a single word. Number Hayes froze. The general commanded her to leave them on. He shifted his gaze to Thorne, who was now standing by the pillar, looking pale and small. Stone explained that he wanted the military police to see exactly how he was found. He wanted the FBI to see the restraints on a general officer. He warned the sergeant that if she took them off, she would be tampering with a federal crime scene. Hayes understood the implication immediately. This wasn't just a complaint anymore. This was a prosecution in the making. She withdrew her hand and turned to Thorne. Her voice dropped to a lethal whisper. She ordered him to the break room, told him to sit down, and commanded him not to speak to anyone. She demanded he give his radio to the rookie. Thorne tried to stammer an excuse, but Hayes barked at him to comply. Thorne handed over the radio, his hands shaking. He looked at the general, then at the wall of camera phones, and finally realized that his narrative of a hero cop stopping a bomber had just evaporated. Hayes turned back to Stone and asked how he wanted to proceed. Stone directed her to his right breast pocket. He told her there was a secure smartphone inside and instructed her to unlock it using code 991. He told her to press the red icon labeled NMCC. Hayes retrieved the ruggedized black phone. She punched in the code. The screen flashed red with the words, National Military Command Center. She hesitated, asking if he wanted her to hold it to his ear. Stone told her to put it on speaker and place it on the floor next to his head. She did as ordered. The line connected instantly. There was no ringing, just a sharp, electronic chirp, followed by a voice that sounded like it came from the bottom of a deep, cold well. The operator identified General Stone and stated they were tracking a catastrophic failure alert on his biometric sensors at Union Station. They asked for his status. Stone spoke clearly into the floor. He declared a code black. He stated he had been assaulted by local law enforcement. He confirmed he was restrained and that his prosthetics were destroyed. He identified the hostile entity as Officer Bradley Thorne, badge number 492. There was a pause on the line. It lasted 3 seconds, but it felt like an hour. When the operator returned, the voice had shifted from concerned to icy efficiency. They confirmed the code black. They stated they were logging the badge number and activating the nearest federal assets. They informed the general that diplomatic security was 5 minutes out and instructed him not to engage further. They told him the cavalry was coming. The line went dead. Sergeant Hayes stood up slowly. She looked at Officer Thorne, who was leaning against the wall, wiping sweat from his forehead. She spoke to him with a voice devoid of sympathy. She told him that he didn't just break a leg. She told him he had just kicked a beehive. There is a persistent myth in law enforcement known as the blue wall of silence. It is the unwritten rule that officers will protect their own, regardless of the misconduct. But Officer Bradley Thorne was about to learn a hard lesson in federal physics. That wall crumbles instantly when the Department of Justice kicks down the front door. 20 minutes after the incident, the precinct was in lockdown. Thorne and his rookie partner, Officer Ryan Miller, were not taken to the break room to get their story straight. They were separated immediately. They were placed in sterile, windowless interview rooms on opposite sides of the building. Their badges were removed and placed in plastic bags. Their service weapons were locked in the evidence vault. In interview room A, Thorne sat with his arms crossed, indignantly rehearsing his defense. He told himself that the suspect reached for his waist. He told himself that he feared for his life and made a split-second decision. He was banking on the union. He believed that, like the dozen complaints before this one, the system would churn for a few months and then bury the error under a pile of paperwork. In interview room B, the atmosphere was different. Officer Miller was sweating. Sitting across from him was not a friendly precinct sergeant, but a cold-eyed investigator from Internal Affairs who had just arrived from headquarters. The investigator placed a legal pad on the table and looked at the young officer. He reminded Miller that he had been on the force for only 4 months. He laid out the 2 paths forward. Miller could have a 30-year career, or he could end his professional life today as an accessory to a federal civil rights violation. Miller looked at his reflection in the one-way mirror. He thought about his mortgage. He thought about his pregnant wife. And he thought about Thorne screaming at him to shut up in the middle of the terminal. The rookie broke. He whispered that the general did not reach. The investigator asked him to speak up. Miller found his voice and stated clearly that he had told Thorne to stop. He admitted that he saw the identification and told Thorne it looked real, but Thorne had said he wanted to teach the man a lesson. The investigator pressed for more. He asked if Thorne had done anything else prior to the engagement. Miller closed his eyes, knowing this was the nail in the coffin. He revealed that Thorne had reached down and turned off his radio just before the takedown. He wanted to kill the audio, but in his arrogance, Thorne had forgotten that their new body cameras possessed a 30-second pre-record buffer. The camera had captured everything, including the premeditation. The investigator nodded and closed his notebook. The blue wall had just fallen. Meanwhile, in the chief of police's office, the air conditioning was running at full blast, but the room felt suffocatingly hot. 3 men stood around a large high-definition monitor. The chief of transit police, a uniformed JAG officer sent from the Pentagon, and Special Agent Vance from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. They were watching the raw footage from Thorne's camera. They watched the aggressive, predatory approach. They watched General Stone try to explain his disability calmly. They heard the whisper, amplified by the precinct's forensic audio software, where Thorne called the general a boy and claimed to own him. And then they heard the sound, the sickening mechanical crunch of the prosthetic shattering. The video ended. The screen went black. The chief of police looked physically ill. He knew that sound was the sound of his department's budget being decimated by lawsuits for the next decade. He cleared his throat, suggesting that they could handle this internally. He proposed an immediate suspension pending investigation and charges of excessive force. Special Agent Vance didn't even look at him. He was busy typing a message on his secure phone. He stated calmly that the chief would not be handling this. The chief protested, claiming it was his officer and his jurisdiction. Vance looked up, his expression flat. He explained that the jurisdiction had changed the moment the slur was used. That made it a hate crime. The identity of the victim made it an assault on a federal officer. And the destruction of a classified Department of Defense prototype made it felony destruction of government property. Vance buttoned his suit jacket and stood up. He informed the chief that the Department of Justice was asserting primary jurisdiction effective immediately. He stated they were taking the files, they were seizing the servers, and they were taking the prisoner. Back in room A, the door opened. Thorne looked up, expecting his union representative. He expected a lawyer who would tell him to stay quiet and let the process work. Instead, a woman he didn't recognize walked in wearing a visitor badge. Thorne demanded to know where his rep was. The woman didn't sit down. She informed Mr. Thorne that the Police Benevolent Association had reviewed the footage 20 minutes ago. She stated that the board had voted unanimously to decline representation. They were currently issuing a press release formally condemning his actions to protect the reputation of the thousands of good officers he had disgraced. Thorne's mouth fell open. He gasped that they couldn't do that he paid his dues. The woman told him simply that he was alone. She advised him that the U.S. Marshals were on their way to transport him to a federal holding facility. Thorne sat back in his chair, the blood draining from his face. For the first time in his 20-year career, the badge wasn't a shield. It was just a piece of metal on a table, and it no longer belonged to him. The end of Officer Bradley Thorne's career did not arrive with a siren or a shout. It arrived with the heavy, industrial rattling of high-tensile steel. The door to interrogation room. A opened, breaking the monotonous hum of the ventilation system that had been Thorne's only companion for the last hour. He looked up, expecting the familiar face of his union representative, or perhaps the sympathetic gaze of a precinct sergeant. Instead, the doorway was filled by two deputy U.S. Marshals. They were imposing figures, dressed in tactical vests, moving with the silent, synchronized efficiency of predators who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. They did not introduce themselves. They did not offer a greeting. They simply stepped into the small room, sucking the oxygen out of the air, and pulled Thorne from his chair. For 20 years, Bradley Thorne had been the one applying the handcuffs. He knew the sound of the ratchet, the feeling of control, and the power of taking a man's freedom. Now, the roles were reversed with a terrifying finality. He felt the cold bite of federal transport restraints against his skin. A heavy steel chain was wrapped around his waist and padlocked tight against the base of his spine, forcing his posture into a rigid, unnatural arch. His wrists were shoved into a black box specifically designed to cover the keyholes and prevent any manipulation, which was then shackled directly to the belly chain. Finally, the marshals kicked his legs apart and clamped heavy irons around his ankles. Stripped of his duty belt, his shoelaces, his badge, and his dignity, Thorne stood trembling in the center of the room. He was no longer an officer of the law. He was processed inventory in the federal penal system. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The knees that had pinned General Stone to the floor now buckled under his own weight. Thorne began to weep, ugly, desperate, gasping sobs that echoed off the cinder block walls. He looked toward the open door, his eyes locking onto Special Agent Vance. The DOJ agent stood holding a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside, catching the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, was Thorne's police shield. It looked small and insignificant inside the bag, just a piece of cheap metal. Thorne begged. The words spilled out of him in a chaotic torrent. He pleaded for 5 minutes. He asked to speak to the general. He swore on his life that he would apologize, that he would mortgage his house to pay for the leg, if only they wouldn't walk him out in chains. Special Agent Vance watched the breakdown with an expression that was neither angry nor sympathetic. It was entirely hollow. He waited for Thorne to gasp for air before speaking. He told the former officer that General Stone did not want an apology. The general was a combat veteran who understood that enemies existed in war. What he did not understand, and what he would not forgive, was a man who used the authority of the state to bully the very citizens he had sworn to protect. Vance signaled the marshals. The time for talking was over. Then began the walk of shame. Because the precinct's secure loading dock was under construction, the marshals had to escort Thorne back through the east hall of Union Station to reach the federal transport van. It was the only route. As the automatic glass doors slid open and the trio stepped into the cavernous main hall, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The crime scene tape had been removed. The hydraulic fluid had been mopped up. But the crowd had not dispersed. In fact, it had grown. Hundreds of commuters lined the path, forming a silent gauntlet. As Thorne shuffled through the terminal, his ankle chains forcing him into a slow, humiliating waddle, the silence was heavier than any scream. There were no jeers, no one threw debris. There was only the collective, crushing weight of hundreds of eyes watching a bully reduced to nothing. Thorne tried to keep his head bowed, staring at the polished granite tiles, but he could feel the gaze of the public burning into him. He passed the exact marble pillar where, less than 2 hours ago, he had whispered that he owned the man in the suit. Now, the only thing Bradley Thorne owned was the orange jumpsuit he would wear for the next decade. The wheels of the justice system usually turn slowly, but when the Department of Justice prosecutes a hate crime involving a high-ranking military official, captured on high-definition video, those wheels spin with the terrifying speed of a tank. 6 months later, the federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. was packed to capacity. The gallery was not filled with Thorne's supporters. Instead, the front 3 rows were a sea of uniforms. Marines in dress blues, Army Rangers in green, and Navy SEALs with tridents gleaming on their chests. They sat in absolute disciplined silence. They did not whisper or shift in their seats. They simply stared at the back of the defendant's head. Bradley Thorne stood before the bench. The transformation was total. He had lost 30 pounds. His skin was sallow and gray from months in protective custody. The swagger was gone, replaced by a permanent tremor in his hands. Judge Catherine Pierce adjusted her reading glasses and looked down from the bench. She spoke directly to the man who had disgraced his oath. She acknowledged that his attorney had argued for leniency, claiming the incident was a momentary lapse of judgment caused by stress. But the judge rejected this narrative entirely. She cited the audio evidence. She cited the whisper. She stated clearly that Thorne did not just break a prosthetic leg. He broke the sacred public trust that allows a civilized society to function. The courtroom held its breath as she read the sentence. For the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, she sentenced him to 120 months. For the count of assault on a federal officer and the destruction of government property, she sentenced him to an additional 60 months. She ordered the sentences to be served consecutively. 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, she ordered immediate restitution to the Department of Defense in the amount of $112,000. Thorne's assets were seized. He was leaving that courtroom bankrupt in every sense of the word. Thorne did not scream this time. He seemed to shrink inside his cheap suit, accepting the finality of his fate. The gavel banged, a sharp wooden crack that signaled the end of his life as a free man. The marshals turned him around, and the room was filled with the sound of chains rattling as he was led through the side door into the darkness of the holding corridor. Outside, on the sweeping marble steps of the courthouse, the spring sun was shining. General Marcus Stone stepped out of the building. He was dressed in a sharp civilian suit, wearing dark sunglasses. He descended the stairs without a cane or a limp. A pack of reporters rushed forward, their microphones thrusting into his path. They shouted questions, hungry for a soundbite. They asked if he felt justice had been served. General Stone stopped. He looked at the cameras, his face unreadable. He did not smile. He simply adjusted his sunglasses, turned his head, and continued walking toward his waiting car. The only sound in the crisp morning air was the rhythmic high-tech hum of his brand-new matte black symbionic leg, pushing him forward. Whir click, whir click, whir click. If you believe that authority should always be held accountable, and that no badge grants the right to abuse, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Share this story, because the only way to prevent the next incident is to make sure the world remembers this one.